to Old Path Ministries in our study through the book of 1 Samuel. We make it to chapter 14 today, and we'll probably get chapter 14 and 15 taken care of today. And what I want to make sure that we look back on real quick, because it's gonna have a great deal to do with kind of what we'll see with the nature of Saul. Isn't it interesting? We've just kind of been introduced, I guess you could say, a little bit to Saul. And by the time that we're done with just chapter 15, we're going to see that God has, especially through Samuel, has made it not only evident that Saul won't be the man that God wanted him to be, but had already warned the people that he never would be. This is the thing that God is able to do. He's able to tell you things before they take place. And so even with all of the caution and everything else, by chapter 15, by the close of it, God is already done with Saul. And we see at chapter 13, that's the way that it ends. Once again, because from chapter 10, you can go back and look at all of this. From chapter 10, verse 8, Saul was given very special instruction, direct instruction by Samuel. Go and wait for me at Gilgal, and I'll come and we'll make an offering. And so, of course, he goes further than he ever should have, and he offers the offering himself. And it's because of that God will no longer respect him as the king. So we're going to see chapter 14 really kind of helps with our understanding of that. You can see from the very beginning, chapter 14 and 15, it is once again Saul doing things in his own wisdom, not realizing just how foolish the course that he is setting forth actually is. And so, real quick, we'll look at this passage here. Verse 14 of chapter 13 is when we see here that it says, "But now your kingdom," this is Samuel speaking to Saul, "your kingdom will not continue, for the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over the people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded to you." So once again, you have the situation where this was not the man of God's choosing. That person is already, we know, David. And now we're seeing that God will say once again to him by chapter 15, it will once again be re-emphasized that God is done with the person of Saul. But really, as far as Samuel is concerned, he won't have any dealings with him either. So in chapter 13, he disobeys. Very clear direction that was given to him. Go and wait. Samuel would be the one who would offer. Samuel is the one that said, I will come and I will offer after those 7 days. So Saul becomes impatient, offers as he's not supposed to. Samuel gets there and rebukes him and says, the government's been taken from you. Your kingship is now gone. And that's the pronouncement that we get at chapter 13, verse 14, as I had mentioned. Again, if you want the reference, again, it is chapter 10, verse 8, where he was supposed to go wait for Samuel for the offering. And then we get to chapter 14. Now, here's what we're going to see in this. And though it doesn't come right out and say it, some people look at Saul as being in his kingship able to wage war and overcome the adversaries. And yet the idea that he's having to do that and that they're not subject to him and not subject to Israel, that should have been the way that it should have been. That God would have given them victory over those people, and there wouldn't be trouble all the time, because there would just be, it would be a sense of peace would have been there, because Israel would have been walking before the Lord, starting with the king, and it would have subdued the nations around them. That's not what we see, because there's always going to be conflict. So that's where we pick up at chapter 14. So let's turn there, and we'll begin at chapter 14. Once again, in this chapter, we will find a place where Saul, given the opportunity, chooses the wrong thing. He really messes up in chapter 15, and we'll see that. Maybe many of you, especially if you've studied through the Old Testament, you will recognize 1 Samuel 15 as being a very, very significant passage because of what is said in it. And it gives us an understanding about how God, when he gives us clear instruction, doesn't expect us to look for a way around his instruction. In fact, he wants us to take that to know when God says, "Thus says the Lord," it's good for us to say, let me make sure I understand exactly what he has said, and then make sure that I act accordingly. Now, nobody gets it perfect, so let's not put a guilt trip on ourselves, but we should get at the place where the times when we fall short or we miss the mark, sin, whatever you want to call it, it is a matter where the heart of the believer should be one of immediate remorse, not because we got caught, but rather because what we did is displeasing to the Lord, and we should learn from those mistakes. In this case, he just continually does those things, and then it's more, I'm sorry that I got caught, and there doesn't seem to be a real brokenness in him, in his heart. He just seems to be kind of a prideful guy because he repeats the same things over and over. It's a pretty interesting thing to consider. So we get to chapter 14. You'll see this. These two chapters will have in each of them an episode where he was given face-to-face, immediate instruction, do exactly like this, and he didn't do it. Or chapter 15 is that way. Chapter 14, he just takes it upon himself and puts a mandate on the people that they couldn't hold. So once again, chapter 14, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word, that we can recognize that you have given us very clear instruction. And Lord, you desire that we would walk with you in a place of integrity, and where we know that you have called out things to us that we should avoid or things that we should do, whatever the case may be, that we would learn the understanding that it is for us to walk, it is for us to do according to your will. We ask, Lord, that you would help us to be obedient to you. And we do thank you that you are a God who forgives. And at the same time, we want to be walking in a place where we don't fail, we don't fall short. We give you all thanks and pray that you would bless this study of your word, and that your people would hear these things and take them to heart. And we ask all of it in Jesus' name. All right, chapter 14. Now it happened one day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Now, what we're going to see, just so that we understand, the Philistines were always, their encampment was always, or their cities were along the Mediterranean coast. Pretty much basically the whole western half of the Mediterranean coast was pretty much solidly under their control, and actually even more than that. But what they've done is come somewhat more inland, because Gilgal's in quite a bit of a ways, and they were close enough where there was this tension. So there was all of this that was going on, and we're going to hear. I know I put up some of these maps before, but you can see where the territory of Benjamin would be, and that's where most of all of this takes place. It's more in the territory of Benjamin, and it gets into parts of Judah to the south and a little bit of Ephraim up in the north, but it's right at Jerusalem above and below, and a little bit too then the west where the Philistines would be. So there's just this conflict that's always taking place. So Jonathan says, let's go on over to the encampment there of the Philistines. What prompted him to do it? Doesn't really say. Didn't tell his father what he was doing. But the interesting thing that you see from the very beginning of this, once they get in place, it's basically, I want to go do this, but I'm going to make sure that the Lord is for us before we go to do this thing. Unfortunately, Saul, though he would say such things, when he would go through the pretense of saying, let's go see what the Lord would have to say. And before the Lord could answer or say anything or give instruction, he's just jumping off and doing it. Jonathan was a completely different guy in this, and you're going to see. And this will kind of play all the way through the rest of this book. And as long as Jonathan is a focus, there's a real difference between he and his father. We'll see it develop quite a bit. So, verse 2, Saul was sitting on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is at Migron, and the people who were with him were 600 men. Now, the people that are mentioned in verse 3 are descendants of Eli and Phinehas, and so the priestly line are those people that are gathered with him. And so those are the ones that are given to us. And it says that he's wearing an ephod. This was in verse 3. But the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. So this shows us the two groups. Again, they're all encamped in the same place, but Jonathan wants to go do this, and Saul is actually with all of the priesthood and the rest. Now, the ephod is mentioned here, and there's some disagreement in the actual language itself, and I'll get to that in just a moment. In verse 4, it says, "Now between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side and a sharp rock on the other side, and the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sene." And these are actual terms that are given to the rock, so it helps everybody to understand who would be reading at the time. They'd be familiar with this based on the description, the geographical area. It doesn't matter that we know exactly where this took place. This would have meant a lot more probably to them at the time of their history, because these would be places that pretty well could be seen. And let's remember, you could probably go find all of these. They're pretty sure that they know exactly where this is being spoken of, but it's such a small area, it wouldn't take too long to try to figure out given where all of these places are. So if you're the type that likes to do this, look up these place names, find the maps, you get a pretty good idea of where all this took place. It could have taken place in the north, south, east, west, doesn't matter that they know the exact location. And really the geography of it only plays into the fact that the Philistines would be able to see the things that were taking place because of their vantage point. Really, that's kind of all that helps with our understanding, or why it's even necessary to that this was all written down. So with all that said, in verse 6 it says, "So Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, 'Come and let us go over to the garrison of the uncircumcised,'" the Philistines, "'and it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." And boy, this shows how different Jonathan seems to be than his father. His father was really good about paying lip service to things. Jonathan seems to be very, very clued in, doing these things that he wants to go do this, but he also says, look, God doesn't need a whole bunch of people, and let's see if he's for us in this. And so he puts forward kind of, if this happens or that happens, we'll have our answer. So he says to his armor bearer in verse 7, he said to him, his armor bearer says to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Go then, here I am with you according to your heart." So Jonathan said, "Very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them." And here's one of two options. Verse 9, "If they say to us, 'Wait until we come down to you,' then we will stand still in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this will be assigned to us." So this is one of those interesting questions, because the text simply doesn't tell us. Did Jonathan get this inside information from the Lord, or is the Lord honoring the idea that he says, well, this will be assigned to us? And so is God responding to a man whose heart seems right in this place and wanting to go and do this? Remember, Jonathan would know that Israel was told from the very beginning of Joshua that if they go into the land, and if they would walk rightly before God, God would deliver the enemies into their hands. I'm sure Jonathan knows that. Jonathan's a righteous man here. So again, the question is, did God prompt him to do it? Or was it his desired way of saying, Lord, I'm going to do these two things, and depending on what they say, we'll know that you want me to go or not? It's just an interesting discussion. I'm of the opinion that Jonathan just said, I know what we're supposed to do. I'll know if God is in it based on what these guys say, and he brings that before the Lord. Well, again, we don't get all the details in this, so it really leaves us to speculate. The best we could do is say, could be either, doesn't matter. What we know is that the answer comes, and then the resulting effect is clear that God was for them. So, in verse 10, it says, but if they say, come up to us. Well, verse 11, so both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden. So this is a mocking kind of a thing that they're saying here. They have real contempt for the Jewish people here, the Hebrews as they call them. And they're assuming that there's going to be some little small contingent of them. Now, the first ones that they encounter, as we're going to find out, it's about 20 guys, and they're the forward group. They're kind of just the sentinels, the lookouts. They're making sure that nothing goes on. And up pops Jonathan and his armor bearer. So they're like, okay, it's just a couple of these guys, or some have come out of their holes. They don't feel in any ways threatened. And really, ultimately, they shouldn't. It's just two guys, basically. At this point, it's only two guys. It's not a big plan here. Well, it says in verse 12, so then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer, and they said, come up to us, and we will show you something. And Jonathan said to the armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. Now, notice this thing. Unlike his father, everything seems to be about Saul. In this case, Jonathan says, God's doing this for his people. God's doing this for Israel. He's delivered them into our hands. And Jonathan would say, I'm the guy who represents Israel in this place. God's given us this victory. Now, how cool is it to have that presence of mind and that recognition that God is doing something? You know it. I love this. It's so cool. So, in verse 13, so Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees with his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. As he came up after him, his armor bearer killed them. So as he engages these guys, he strikes them, and then the armor bearer finishes them off. Now, how many of them were there? Well, that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer had made was about 20 men within about a half of an acre of land, or some translations would add what a yoke of oxen could plow in a day. So it's a small area, and it happens pretty quickly. Now, it gets the attention of some other people, because what they see is the bodies strewn around. You'll see that the rest of the guys, they only see two guys from what they can see, but they're assuming that there's more, because there's all these Philistine bodies scattered around. Well, God's clearly giving Jonathan supernatural ability here. So it says this, and there was trembling in the camp, in the field, and among the people. The garrison and the raiders also trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it was a very great trembling. So God, once again, not only gives Jonathan the ability, but he assists them in just a very physical way. Makes the ground shake, and it just leads to panic. And it's the beginning of the panic that was going to start taking place, because everything was going to break loose all at the same time. So clearly God was in this. And it's all prompted by a man who, Jonathan, says, I want to go do this thing. The person who is there, some would call him squire, his armor bearer, the person who would go and tend to him, this fighting man, it's just those two. And Jonathan begins by saying, we'll know if God's for us based on how they react to us. They reacted exactly like Jonathan would hope that they would, that God was going to give them a victory, and now it starts. So he encounters these 20 guys, takes them out, the ground quakes. Now panic is starting to happen among the Philistines. They're seeing the dead bodies, assuming it's a full-on attack, and now God starts to bring supernatural things happening right under the ground underneath them. Imagine this, the terror that would be. Let's remember one other thing, too. There's a history of Israel that the Philistines already know. We've read that. They know what has happened as God brought them out of Egypt. Remember when they had the Ark of the Covenant, they had taken it. They knew that God was displeased with it, knowing what his track record was, and now they're finding their soldiers dead on the ground, and the ground is shaking. They have a good idea of what's taking place. So there's this great mixture of the people of Israel feeling emboldened to go, but that also God is doing things, and it's making it evident to those who are seeing and hearing that something major is taking place. So it says, now the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and there was the multitude melting away, and they went here and there. Now this tells you how close they are in proximity, because they can see from their vantage point the commotion of what's taking place among the Philistines. But Saul doesn't know what's going on. So here's what takes place. It's a series of events. So Saul said to the people who were with him, now call the roll and see who has gone out from us And when they had called the roll, surprisingly, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, bring me the ark here. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit, the language itself, the translation could potentially be a problem here. By mentioning the ark, it's the Ark of the Covenant. But we already know that he's called the high priest, who is wearing the ephod, where you would have the breastplate and what they call the Urim and the Thummim. And that would be where they would be able to look at the lots, ask and inquire of God, and God would answer through the stones that were there. And that would be in the breastplate. The translation that seems best fitting here, there's nothing that would tell us that the ark would be where they are. They're in the field. They're not at the place of corporate worship. So it says ark here, but it's more than likely it is that way of saying, bring the high priest here, let's inquire of the Lord. And there's something that is said after this that gives the impression that it is indeed him putting his hand in there, and they're trying to determine what is the will of God. So Saul begins by doing the right thing. Let's inquire of God, what should we do? There's a bunch of commotion there. The only people missing from our group that we know of is Jonathan and his armor bearer, but what's two guys doing there that would cause this? Let's find out what the Lord's doing. So he said, bring the ark of God here, for at the time the ark of God was with the children of Israel. Now it happened while Saul talked to the priest that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. That's a way of saying, withdraw your hand. The ark doesn't fit in this narrative, but the breastplate and the inquiring of God. The foolishness of Saul is to say, let's not inquire of God any longer. Take your hands back. We're going. So he says, this is just so Saul. Let's find out what God has to say. The answer doesn't come as soon as he wants to. Sounds a lot like chapter 13. Let's just go. Well, it works out for Israel as far as the war is concerned, but it could have been much better. And if it wasn't for Saul always interjecting himself, it's just such a shame. So verse 19, and it happened while Saul talked with the priest that the noise which was in the camp was great. So he said, withdraw your hand. Verse 20, then Saul and all the people who were with him assembled, and they went to battle. And indeed, every man's sword was against his neighbor, and there was very great confusion. That's on the Philistine side. That's not on the on Israel's side. Moreover, now these are interesting people. Once again, we don't know how they got to this position, where they would be there. We don't know if they were taken as just people that were conquered and taken as captive and forced to serve. We don't even know about the captives or the people that looked like they may have defected and gone away from either of the army. They're just hiding in the hills. But a couple of groups of people are mentioned as joining Saul in the attack. So it says in verse 21, moreover, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines before that time, who went up with them into the camp from the surrounding country, they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So even the people that were in the middle of the encampment of the Philistines, who the Philistines had as part of their army that's there, turn during the battle, and they begin to fight for Israel rather than for the Philistines. Likewise, verse 22, all the men of Israel who had hidden in the mountains of Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines had fled, they followed hard after them in the battle. And so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle shifted to Beth Aven. Now, best as we can tell, if we understand where these places are, it's covering the area from east to west for several miles. That's where the route takes place. And it continues and it goes. So the men of Israel were distressed that day. Now, after all of this work that has gone on, the shift is a little bit, there's a respite that takes place. The men are wearied and they're gathering back together, and Saul really wants to finish the job. Problem is that the guys are pretty wiped out from all of the battle, and this would be the time when you get some water, get something to eat, revitalize yourself, especially if you're going to be pressing forward. Here is the problem, and again, if the Lord had been consulted and given direction, he probably wouldn't have asked him to do something like this. His instruction probably could have been much different than what he actually had. He certainly wouldn't have instructed him to do this, because what Saul's about to say makes no sense whatsoever. It's just the ramblings of a zealot doing stuff that seems right to him, not even understanding the cost to the people who would have to be doing the fighting. And because of what he says, it creates a real problem that ultimately comes back on him, and you'll see what it is. Verse 24. So the men of Israel, they were distressed that day, and Saul had placed the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening before I have taken vengeance on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. Do you see the arrogance in this? Now, not only can you see that the men are tired and would really need something for sustenance, they're weary, they're exhausted, but here Saul makes it about him. I will not let anybody eat until I have had my vengeance on my enemies. Where's the Lord in this? Where is the children of Israel in this? It's all about the king. Isn't that, though, the warning that they got from chapter 8? This guy is going to be a self-serving person, putting everybody into his service, going to take the best of everything that you have for himself, and he's going to leave what's left of it to you, but he's going to take everything for himself. This is an ego-driven man, and incredibly insecure, as we will see as this develops. This is the worst possible kind of a king that they could have ever had, and yet it was the man of their choosing. It's what they wanted. So, any man that eats, verse 24, cursed is the man who eats any food for this in this evening before I have taken vengeance, verse 24, on my enemies. So none of the people tasted food. Now all the people of the land had come to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. So it's a place clearly where there are bees and all of that activity, and you could see the honeycombs and the honey was all around them. Now verse 26, or verse 27 rather, but Jonathan had not heard his father's charge to the people with that oath. Therefore he stretched out the end of his rod that was in his hand, and then he dipped it in the honeycomb, put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance was brightened. So he's among those guys. He's wearied from all of the fighting. He shows up after Saul has said it. He's never heard it, sees that there's honey everywhere, and says, I need this. And so it's basically the sugar rush, but he takes something that is of sustenance to him. And so he does this. I can imagine the people looking at what he has just done. It's like, I'm sure that half of them would have thought, well, why can't we? And the other half was probably in their minds thinking something along the lines of, oh, he must not know what his dad's going to do, or he's going to have some real trouble. So you can see the intrigue of all of this. So we read this in verse 28, so one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. And so Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance has brightened because I tasted just a little bit of the honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoils of their enemies, which they found. For now would there not have been even a greater slaughter among the Philistines? So basically he calls out his dad and says, that's ridiculous, my paraphrase. It's ridiculous that he would put this restraint on you. Just imagine if he had said, take the plunder and get something to eat for yourself. We could have done a whole lot more than we've done this day. Because now you're wearied and wiped out, and you can't even now eat something to replenish your strength. He says, take a look at me. I just had a little bit of honey. Look at how that's revitalized me. So basically they see this as an invitation. Verse 31. So now they had driven back the Philistines that day to Michmash and Ajalon, and so the people were very faint. So this is miles from where it first started. And the people rushed on the spoil, and they took sheep, oxen, and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. That is a real problem. Now, this tells you they are famished, but the idea that they would strike down an animal and it was laying in its own blood was so wrong as far as God was concerned. There was a real protocol to this. If an animal was to be put to death and eaten, it would be to be drained of its blood. That's according to the law, Leviticus 17. It's clear. This is so outside, but they're just ravenous at this point. So look at what Saul has created. He's created by a silly edict, and then Jonathan, just in the absence of knowledge of what what his dad had said, does a simple thing. It says it's absurd that he would ask that. Look at everybody's exhausted. Imagine how much better this has gone. And so now people take license with this. It doesn't excuse anybody in this. They're all equally to be blamed here because Saul never should have said it, but the people should have never done something that was so lawless. Well, so it says in verse 33 rather, so then they told Saul, saying, look, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with blood. And so he said, you have dealt treacherously. Roll a large stone to me this day. And then Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, bring me every man's oxen that we may, and every man's sheep, and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with blood. So every one of the people brought his ox to him that night and slaughtered them there. Okay, great. Verse 35, so Saul built an altar to the Lord, and there was the altar that the altar that was built to the Lord. Now, in this, Saul has done not a bad thing. It's like, wait a minute, guys, you're sinning against God by eating meat that is sitting there settled in its own blood. It's it's not kosher. It's not acceptable. God would never allow such a thing. So bring a stone and let's do this the right way, that the blood drains off and the animal is not laying in its own blood. Don't offend God further than you've already done so. That's a kingly thing to do. That's a godly thing to do. But all of this was caused by something God told him never told him to do. Don't make people abstain from eating something because you've created this condition. So once again, the problem that he's looking to correct is a problem that he ultimately created, and it's about to get worse. Now, verse 36, so Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. And then the priest said, let us draw near to God here. So back to the idea. Saul, let's get back on track. Let's make sure that the Lord wants us to go out on this thing. Well, this is, once again, going to manifest the heart of Saul. And it's going to bring to a head all of the events that took place. Jonathan, the way that he had handled things, Saul, the way that he had handled things, and God's going to let them know he's displeased with how all of this took place. So Saul asked counsel of God, verse 37, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? But God did not answer him that day. So Saul said, come over here, all you chiefs of the people, and know and see what sin was done today. So he assumes, since God's not speaking, this must be an Achan Ai thing with Joshua, right? So there's got to be sin in the camp here. Let's find out who's at fault in this matter. So, for as the Lord lives, verse 39, who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, even if it's Jonathan my son, he will surely die. He has no clue what Jonathan has done at this point. He's just saying that it doesn't matter who it is. It could even be Jonathan. He's dead if it's him that sinned. Wishes he had those words back. But not a man among the people answered him. Then he said to all of Israel, you be on one side, and my son Jonathan and I will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore, verse 41, Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, give me a perfect lot. Help me to know who has caused this problem. And so Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. Now imagine if you're Saul. God, we want to find out who it is. It's got to be those people over there. And the lot says, no, Saul, it's one of you two. So the rest of the people are off the hook. So what you have left is Saul, who made really an idiotic decree, and then Jonathan, who didn't obey it, though he didn't know about it. So again, this is a Saul problem, but look at who ends up getting pointed at here, because it's going to manifest to Saul what you did was not what God had wanted, and now you're put in the place of having to follow up and back up your own words. So Saul said, cast lots between my son Jonathan and me, and so Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. Jonathan told him and said, I only tasted a little honey at the end of a rod that was in my hand, so now I must die. So he's going to take it. Okay, I didn't know it. Didn't even say that. Notice he doesn't try to give a defense. I did this. Well, so then notice Saul answered, God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. Now, again, what a harebrained thing he's caused. This is his own arrogance. It's his own unwillingness to follow through everything that God would ask him to do. God never told him to make such a ridiculous edict. And it ensnared his son innocently, and now Jonathan is having to be put to death for this. We know Jonathan survives it, but see how it manifests everything? So verse 46, or verse 45, so then the people said to Saul, so Jonathan will surely die? Shall Jonathan die, rather? Who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. And so the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Think about this. The people moved against the king that day. These are the same people that said, we want a king to lead us like every other nation. So this king gives an edict. It is not obeyed on a technicality, and on that technicality, his son should be put to death. He says, you're going to die. The people said, not on our watch, it's not. You see how already disjointed this is? You see why God did not want them to be governed by man or by a king? This is just, what a mess, right? So we see what happens here. Then Saul returned to his returned from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. It means they stopped. No more pursuit. They both went to their separate places. So Saul established his sovereignty over Israel, and he fought against his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the people of Ammon, against Edom, that's all the stuff to the east, the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Where he turned, he harassed them. But that just shows he's having problems everywhere he looks. So there's never rest under Saul, of course. So he gathered an army, he attacked the Amalekites and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. And the sons of Saul, interestingly enough, the three that are mentioned here, he has more, but the three that are mentioned here, Jonathan, Jishu, and Malchishua, these are the three that die with him when the Philistines put them to death later on in this book. And then, of course, the two daughters, one of which we will know because of David. But the oldest is Merab, and the younger, at verse 49, is Michal. So it goes through the rest of his family in verses 50 and 51. But notice this, in verse 52. Now there was fierce war with the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man and valiant man, he took him for himself. This goes back to chapter 8. If you remember, he's going to take your sons and your daughters. He's going to put them into service for him. So the idea that there was constant conflict just tells you again how they as a people had been disobedient for such a long time. This never should have been the case. They should have had peace at because they had subdued the nations around them. Clearly, these nations are not subdued. He was victorious in battle, but he never subdued them. He never removed them. And you'll see, I think, we get a little hint as to why that is. I don't think, though we don't get the details here. It doesn't appear as though he's ever really doing the things that God would ask him to do to the fullest. But we get a great example of it here in chapter 15. So Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Important. He reminds him of everything. The people wanted a king. They were cautioned against it. I cautioned them personally. They still chose to have a king, and I anointed you. You were that guy who was chosen. Now, with all of that as the setup, listen carefully to what you're supposed to do, Saul. This is God's word. Do this. So here's what it says. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. and do not spare them, but kill both men and women, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Wow, that's a pretty heavy thing. Now, think about how many generations. It has been hundreds of years since this happened. But God has said, now it's come to the point where the wickedness, and we're going to get to a little bit of more of what's going on here. The people, God is finally now going to bring judgment on a people who had attacked Israel after the Exodus. And he calls it Amalek because that was the king at the time. That's not, the guy's not the same person now. It's the people known by his name, the Amalekites, the people of Amalek. So with that being said, God says, now is the time I'm going to judge them all, and I want you to make sure none of them remains. Now, some people really have a problem with this. This is so impossible for them to wrap their minds around. Because once again, people love to talk about the love of God, but they never want to talk about his justice and his judgment. And we're going to notice that this is an indiscriminate destruction of everybody that they see, as you're going to notice here. It's very, very subtle. It's very nuanced, but it is very directed. And as they're going to do this, you're going to notice that they're going to encounter a group of people called the Kenites. Now, nowhere does God say to do anything towards the Kenites. This is only towards the Amalekites. God wants to judge those people entirely and leave nothing of them as a remembrance. Now, people see that and they just go, that's cruel, that's wrong. Okay. You're making God live according to your sensibilities, which is nonsense. He doesn't live according to what you say is right and wrong. So we can get that out of the way to begin with. But this is precisely what God has done in times past. Think of the flood. That was the entirety of humanity that God said, I am judging because their wickedness is beyond repair. And he's going to wipe them out. That's what was supposed to happen with the Amalekites. And let's remember, this is hundreds of years later. So what it has come to is it is so bad that God wants them done as an entire group of people. Nothing in this tells us that the Kenites that they meet up with are some godly people or anything else, but God is not asking Israel to judge them, only the Amalekites. So keep all of that in mind. We don't want to try to apply our own standard of what's right and wrong on God because he sees things that we don't see. And it's not as though they haven't had opportunity, but they have come to the point of such wickedness that God wants them done. And it's going to also put Saul as king over the land of Israel, and he's supposed to be the person who carries out God's order, is to cleanse the land of the people who have already so many times brought their destruction of their godlessness and their spirituality and corrupted the people. So God is focused on one group of people for one specific time. Nowhere you hear all the time, people say, oh, he's so genocidal, God does the things that he does. He's very, very precise about what he wants done here, and we'll see it. Well, so Saul gathered the people together, numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek, and he lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, people that were close by, depart and get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So notice that. God is judging a specific group of people for a specific action, and apparently it has gotten much worse since. That's just by implication. But as far as the Kenites are concerned, God has no gripe with them. He's not asking them to anything other than just stand aside. So the Kenites, they departed from among the Amalekites. Saul attacked Amalek, the Amalekites, from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. That's a huge, broad area. So it says he also took, now here's where it begins to be a problem. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. So it wasn't Amalek. When he says, oh, go and attack Amalek, it's not the king. It's the kingdom that comes from that original king, Amalek, or the Amalekites, but at this time the king was a guy named Agag. So the king of the Amalekites, he took him alive, but he utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, of the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good. All the things that would have been plunder and useful. They took all of those things. But notice, And it says they were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. So they took the best. They were unwilling to do what God asked them to do because they felt that there was something in it for them if they were disobedient. So they didn't pay attention. God spoke, they disobeyed. Not only Saul, but the people. And the people will tend to follow the leader, right? Verse 10, Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, and he said, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned his back from following me, and he has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Now, when we hear God say, and it's said in other places too, we see this in chapter 6 of Genesis when he judges mankind at the flood, that it depending on what translation you're looking at, it gives the impression that God is going, man, I wish I'd never done that. I'm so sorry that I did that. That's the things that we say because we will have regret because we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. We have to always remember when we read things like that, God knew the outcome. This is just a better expression of saying, it brings sorrow to my heart that it has come to this. Because remember, God didn't want to give him a king. Remember, God had already said at that point in chapter 8, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They reject me. Give them what they want. So God already knew the outcome of this. It's more of an expression, just try to put it into English, for a God who knows all things in advance to be able to say, it's so distasteful to me that it has come to this. I have such regret in my heart that this is what the state of affairs is. That's what's being said here. So it's not as though God goes, man, I wish I had that to do over again. That's what we do. That's not what he does. He knows what's taking place. So, with that being said, verse 10, Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret greatly that I've done this. Now, verse 12, So Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and it was told to Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he has set up a monument for himself. And he has gone on around and passed by and gone down to Gilgal. And so Samuel sent to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you in the name of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. So finally he tracks him down. Already Saul is taking all the credit for the things that he's done. He's made his circuit, made a monument, all the rest of it. Now Samuel says, it's time for you to kind of have to take your medicine here. So he calls for him, and of course Saul says, I did everything that the Lord said to do. Well, Samuel said, well, then what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen and sacrificed to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to him, Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord has said to me just last night. And he said to him, Speak on. Well, notice this. Typical Saul. He's the guy who's supposed to be the, quote, leader of the people. So anything that they do, he is then ultimately responsible for. And if he had given direction, he should have been the one to said, here's what the Lord said. We're not taking anything back with us. Now remember, he's already gone on the tour. He's already made the monuments. He's already done the stuff. He knows what's taken place. Now he's trying to blame the people. Now Samuel says, quiet. So Samuel said to him, When you were little in your own eyes, were you not the head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over all of Israel? Remember, basically, Samuel says to him, Saul, don't you remember when you thought, who am I that you would have me to do these kind of things? Was it not me that anointed you and said, you're God's chosen man? So what is going to go on here? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and I have brought back Agag, the king of the Amalekites. So do you see how he's immediately contradicted himself? That's not what God has said. Wipe them out, king on down. Don't even leave the animals alive. Samuel has already said, what is the animals that I hear? Clearly you haven't done what you're supposed to. Now here Saul says, I even brought back Amalek. It's a trophy, basically. Notice what it says. So I did obey the voice, verse 20. Now look at verse 21. Again, he's blaming the people. But the people, they took the plunder, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Now, even if all of that was true, what Saul should have done the moment that the Saul took place, he should have said to the people, you have taken something that I did not direct. God said no. As soon as Samuel, I am sorry I keep doing that. As soon as Saul had seen that they had been disobedient, even if we follow his story, he should have finished the job right there on the spot rather than bring them all the way back and try to make it seem as though, well, the people did it. Well, who's their leader? Who's ultimately accountable? That's what they're going to get to. So the people took the plunder of the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things that should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord. So he blames them entirely. Look at verse 22. This is really instructive for us. Here's what Samuel says to him, verse 22. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed rather than the fat of rams. But rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as iniquity or idolatry. Now think about this. Witchcraft and iniquity and idolatry were big deals. And so they were worthy of death if you were doing those things. And here Samuel says, you want to know what's even better than that? Be obedient. And stubbornness is just as bad, or disobedience rather, is as bad as all of these other punishable by death crimes. So he says, now, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. This is a repeat of the end of chapter 13, or verse 14 of chapter 13. This is a reminder to him, yet again you've done things that has made God disqualify you. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and I obeyed their voice. So once again, this is a problem. You have done what should never have been done. You're blaming the people and you're saying it's their fault because you were afraid of them. And yet you're the king. What's to fear? To lead them to the place of being obedient to the Lord? Why would you fear that? Let the Lord deal with their hearts. You then should have dealt rightfully and done exactly as God had given you direct command. Big issue. So verse 25, therefore, here's Saul saying this, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king. So here Samuel sees this play by Saul. Saul, okay, I've goofed up. Forgive me and go back with me, because it gives him that credibility. Samuel is there. This is the man of God. And it would really look bad if Samuel had turned his back. Look at what happens. So as Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe and it tore. And so Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and he has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you are. Now, at this point, still yet, Samuel doesn't know who that person is. It's David. Samuel does know this. God is done with you as the king. Your tearing of my robe is an indication. It's a good visual to understand. God has torn the kingdom away from you, and God has chosen somebody who's better than you are. Now, imagine that for a king to hear that. It'll help you to understand the animosity that he has towards David very shortly hereafter, because he'll see that that's probably the guy that's been spoken of. So it says this. Now, interesting that God says, I'm going to tear the kingdom from you, but notice what else is said. Also, the strength of Israel will not lie, nor will it relent, for he is not a man that he should relent. That's basically a way of saying Israel's going to continue on. You're done as king, but Israel will not be done. You're the one who is done here. So, verse 30, and then he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. So he does in a way change his mind. Okay, for the sake of Israel, it's good that they at least see you as king as long as it takes for God to reveal who this next person is. But look at what it says. It's very sad. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously, and Agag said, now whether this is in his mind or if he says this out loud doesn't really say, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. So notice what he says to Agag. It's an interesting thing. This is speaking of the violence of the Amalekites. And so here Samuel says, you think that you're getting off without having to pay the price for this. But just as you have made so many by your war and your violence and your wickedness, you've made so many mothers have to live without their sons because you've put them to death, so will your mother be the same way. And he hacks them to pieces. What should have happened at the hands of Saul and the people when they went to war with them, Samuel has to finish these things up. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to the house at his house at Gibeah. And Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. It's a reiteration. But notice the difference in this. It has taken such a short amount of time as the narrative goes. Now, again, years have passed in this. But the sadness is that Saul would get in a place where he would do some things well, but never finished the job of being obedient all the way through. And it always led to horrible consequence, to the point where God said, I'm to the point where it's such a regrettable thing that it's come to this. So we're going to pick up and we're going to see that it will be a real difficult time for Israel under Saul up until the time of David. When David is revealed, there's going to be instant jealousy that you'll see from him along with the other horrible traits of Saul. And so we'll pick that up next week as we get into it. If you have any questions, as I always like to say, if you have questions about what we've covered here today, please send us an email. You can get there through the website, which is at www.oldpaththeology.net. And there's an email response there. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't had a chance to subscribe, go ahead and do so. You'll know when we're putting up our New Testament studies at the middle of the week, and our Old Testament studies as we go through both of the books simultaneously. They're a book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse study of every book of the Bible, as long as it takes us to get through those. But we feel that studying all the way through the Scripture is incredibly important. It's the best way for us to know the full counsel of God, as it's referred to. But I also do some topical things from time to time, and we're putting up content often. So this will be a way for you to get notification of that. So with that being said, we'll pick up at chapter 16 next week, and I pray that this has been helpful in understanding the importance of when God speaks. It's best to know the full extent of what he has said, and then it's best to be obedient to what he has asked us to do. It's the best way to walk in a place of fellowship and right walk with him, and it is what he is due as we honor him. So we give thanks. And so next week we'll pick up at chapter 16. Until then, I pray that God blesses your study of his word.